The long drive through winding mountain roads had given me plenty of time to imagine the quiet relief of arriving at the cabin. After 6 exhausting hours behind the wheel, all I wanted was the familiar creak of the porch steps, the pine-scented air, and the deep silence that always wrapped around the place like a blanket. This cabin had been my family's refuge for generations, a constant in a world that never stopped changing. I expected peace. What I found instead was a moment so surreal that it felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. As my tires crunched onto the gravel driveway, a strange unease settled in my chest. Something about the scene ahead didn't align with memory. The porch looked occupied, not abandoned as it should have been after weeks of absence. When I rounded the final bend and saw figures standing where no one should have been, my heart dropped. There, on my porch, stood Patricia Thornberry, the HOA president whose reputation for control and confrontation was legendary. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a sharply dressed woman holding a clipboard, the unmistakable posture of a professional at work. They looked as if they belonged there, as if the cabin had quietly changed hands while I was gone. The moment Patricia saw my truck, the air shifted. Her face drained of color, shock flashing across her features before hardening into something calculated. In an instant, she reached for her phone, her movements sharp and frantic. From behind the windshield, I watched in disbelief as she began reporting me as an intruder, her voice loud, trembling, and laced with theatrical fear. The accusation hit harder than any shouted insult could have. This wasn't just confrontation, it was erasure. In her words, I no longer existed as the rightful owner of my own home. I sat frozen for a heartbeat, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing. This cabin had belonged to my family since the early 70s. Every beam and window held memories. Holidays, summers, losses, and quiet mornings spent watching fog lift from the trees. And now, standing on that same porch, someone was declaring me a trespasser. The absurdity of it collided with a rising anger that threatened to boil over, but disbelief kept me still. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the gravel felt louder than it ever had beneath my boots. I kept my hands visible, moving slowly, aware that any sudden motion could be twisted into another false claim. Patricia's voice climbed higher as I approached, her story growing more dramatic with every sentence. The woman with the clipboard glanced between us, confusion flickering across her face, clearly unprepared for the reality unfolding in front of her. Then I saw it, the for sale sign planted firmly in my yard. My breath caught as I read the price beneath the agent's photograph. My cabin listed like a commodity, reduced to a number and a lie. In that instant, the shock fully settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a power play gone too far. This was an outright theft unfolding in real time. The place I had driven hours to protect and return to had been claimed, marketed, and nearly erased, all before I could even turn off the engine. Patricia Thornberry had not always been the menace she eventually became, but power has a way of sharpening a person's worst instincts. When she first assumed the role of HOA president, most residents viewed her as mildly irritating at best, the sort of person who thrived on rules and schedules but stayed within the boundaries of reason. Over time, however, that balance disappeared. Authority became her identity, and control turned into an obsession that seeped into every corner of the neighborhood. What began as strict enforcement slowly transformed into something far more invasive and unsettling. She treated the HOA bylaws not as guidelines meant to preserve harmony, but as weapons to assert dominance. Patricia measured lawns with a ruler, crouching in the grass to ensure no blade exceeded the permitted height. She fined residents for the most trivial offenses, from bird feeders painted the wrong shade to porch furniture positioned a few inches off regulation. Each citation seemed to give her a visible sense of satisfaction, as if the act of penalizing others confirmed her importance. Neighbors learned to dread the sight of her spotless white sedan creeping through the community at an unhurried pace, her eyes scanning driveways and yards like a predator searching for prey. The rules were never applied with fairness or empathy. Context meant nothing to her. A trash bin left out minutes too long, a car parked slightly crooked, or a wreath deemed seasonally inappropriate were all treated as serious violations. Appeals were pointless. Patricia dismissed explanations with a tight smile and a reminder that rules are rules. She spoke often about maintaining standards, but what she truly craved was submission. Compliance wasn't enough. She wanted residents to feel watched, corrected, and ultimately powerless. Her behavior extended beyond public enforcement and into private intrusion. She prowled around properties when owners were away, claiming she was safeguarding the community. In reality, she was gathering information, noting absences, boundaries, and perceived vulnerabilities. She spoke in vague, bureaucratic language about preservation and improvement projects, cloaking her intentions in official-sounding jargon that discouraged questions. Many residents ignored her emails, assuming they were just more self-important ramblings. Few realized how far she was willing to go. Even her own household reflected the imbalance she imposed on others. Her husband, Dennis, seemed to fade into the background more with each passing year, his quiet demeanor overshadowed by her relentless presence. He rarely spoke at meetings and avoided eye contact, as if years of living under her authority had taught him silence was safer. To Patricia, control was not just a role she played as HOA president, it was the air she breathed. Crossing lines became second nature for her. She blurred the distinction between oversight and ownership, convincing herself that anything within the neighborhood ultimately fell under her dominion. In her mind, rules justified any action, no matter how extreme. That belief emboldened her to escalate from petty fines to outright deception, from intimidation to criminal acts. By the time she stood on my porch claiming my cabin as her own, she had long since abandoned reason. The HOA presidency was no longer a position she held, it was a throne she believed entitled her to everything around her, including property that was never hers to claim. The realization didn't strike all at once. It crept in slowly, like a cold spreading through my chest. At first, my attention was fixed on Patricia's frantic performance and the confusion on the real estate agent's face. Then my eyes drifted across the yard, and that was when I saw it. A sleek, professionally printed sign stood planted in the soil near the porch, its edges clean and confident, as if it had every right to be there. For a moment, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. That sign did not belong on my property, and yet there it was, declaring to the world that my home was for sale. As I stepped closer, the details became painfully clear. The agent's photograph smiled back at me, polished and reassuring, and beneath it sat an asking price that made my stomach tighten. My cabin, my family's cabin, reduced to a listing figure and marketed like an empty shell. I felt a strange disconnect, as though I were standing outside my own life, watching someone else's disaster unfold. I hadn't authorized anything. I hadn't spoken to an agent, signed papers, or even entertained the idea of selling. Still, the sign stood firm, silent proof that something deeply wrong had been set in motion. The weight of the violations settled in as I imagined strangers walking through the cabin, people I'd never met opening doors, peering into rooms filled with memories, judging the value of spaces that held decades of family history. The thought made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about property, it was about trust being shattered. Someone had decided that my absence made my home fair game, that my silence gave them permission to rewrite ownership itself. When the agent spoke, her uncertainty only added to the surreal nature of the moment. She explained that she had been provided with complete documentation, everything needed to list the property legitimately, transfer papers, tax records, and signatures that, at a glance, appeared authentic. Hearing that was almost worse than seeing the sign. It meant this wasn't a simple misunderstanding or an overreach that could be corrected with a phone call. It was a carefully constructed deception designed to look real enough to fool professionals. My anger rose, hot and sharp, but beneath it was a deeper sense of disbelief. How could someone go to such lengths? How could my name, my signature, and my ownership be replicated so convincingly that an entire sale process could begin without my knowledge? The audacity of it all was staggering. While I had been away caring for my injured aunt, dealing with hospital visits and paperwork, my home had been quietly transformed into a commodity, paraded before potential buyers as if it were already lost to me. The most unsettling part was how close it had come to succeeding. Viewings had been scheduled, offers had been made, the machinery of a sale had been grinding forward indifferent to the truth. Had I returned a week later, or even a few days, the outcome might have been irreversible. Standing there, staring at that sign, I understood just how fragile ownership could be when faced with deliberate fraud. My home hadn't just been listed for sale without my knowledge. It had been stolen in spirit long before anyone tried to steal it on paper. The situation unraveled with a speed that left no room to breathe. What began as a shocking discovery quickly escalated into a full-blown confrontation fueled by lies carefully rehearsed and emotions put on display like props in a performance. Patricia's tears flowed freely as soon as the police arrived, each sob timed perfectly to her story. She clutched at her chest, her voice quivering as she painted herself as a frightened homeowner under siege. To an outsider, the scene might have looked convincing. To me, it was a grotesque distortion of reality, unfolding in my own front yard. As the officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands hovering near their holsters, the tension thickened. Patricia rushed toward them, recounting her version of events with breathless urgency. According to her, I was an intruder attempting to seize her family property. She spoke with absolute certainty, using my own cabin's address as if it had always been hers. Every sentence pushed the narrative further from the truth, yet she delivered it with such confidence that it demanded to be taken seriously. I stood a few feet away, stunned by how easily fiction could masquerade as fact when delivered with enough drama. When I tried to explain, she interrupted constantly, raising her voice, insisting I was dangerous. She pointed out a supposed bulge in my pocket, suggesting it might be a weapon. In reality, it was nothing more than my key fob, but the damage was done. The officer's posture stiffened, and the air grew heavier. In that moment, I understood how fragile my position was. Logic and truth mattered, but so did perception, and Patricia was working tirelessly to shape it. The forged documents became her strongest shield. She claimed to possess deeds, tax records, and inheritance papers that proved her ownership. The real estate agent, clearly shaken, confirmed that the paperwork she had been shown appeared legitimate. Hearing that felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. This wasn't just a matter of one person lying to the police. It was an elaborate scheme supported by documents designed to withstand scrutiny. Patricia leaned into that advantage, her tears slowing as her confidence grew, as if the papers themselves had granted her authority. The officers made the only decision they could under the circumstances. With two competing claims and emotions running high, they separated us and initiated an investigation. Being escorted away from my own property was humiliating, even though I understood the procedure. Patricia watched with a mixture of triumph and wounded innocence, her earlier hysteria giving way to a tight, satisfied expression she couldn't quite hide. At the station, the standoff continued in a quieter but no less intense form. While Patricia's performance played on repeat in my mind, the reality began to reassert itself through careful verification. Phone calls were made, databases checked, signatures examined. The truth emerged piece by piece, dismantling the lies she had built. By the time the forged deeds were exposed for what they were, Patricia's tears had lost their power. What remained was the undeniable fact that her carefully staged crisis had been nothing more than a calculated attempt to steal what was never hers, using deception, theatrics, and the authority she believed would shield her from consequences. The fall was as dramatic as the rise had been, but this time there was no illusion of control left to hide behind. Once the investigation moved beyond my front yard and into official hands, the image Patricia Thornberry had carefully curated for years began to fracture. The authority she wielded as HOA president meant nothing in a courtroom where titles dissolved and facts stood on their own. What emerged was not a misunderstood community leader, but a pattern of calculated deception driven by entitlement and greed. As evidence accumulated, the scope of her actions became impossible to ignore. Forged deeds, falsified tax records, and counterfeit signatures painted a picture of someone who had planned every step with chilling precision. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or an emotional misunderstanding. It was a sustained effort to strip someone else of their property under the cover of bureaucracy and false legitimacy. The same meticulous attention she once devoted to enforcing HOA bylaws had been redirected toward committing serious crimes. In court, Patricia attempted to reclaim control through performance, arriving dressed in somber black, pearls resting neatly at her collar. She spoke with the same confidence she once used to intimidate neighbors, insisting she genuinely believed the cabin was her inheritance. But this time, her words were weighed against testimony and records, not fear and authority. Neighbors described years of overreach, obsession, and manipulation. Real estate professionals explained how they had been misled by documents that appeared expertly crafted. Even those closest to her revealed a fixation on acquiring properties within the community. The narrative she clung to unraveled under simple scrutiny. Dates didn't align, family histories contradicted her claims. Each inconsistency chipped away at the facade until nothing remained but the truth. When confronted with evidence she could not explain, her confidence faltered. The certainty in her voice gave way to deflection, then silence. For the first time, she was no longer directing the situation, she was reacting to it. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on every charge. Fraud, identity theft, burglary, attempted theft of real property. The words echoed with finality, transforming her from an HOA tyrant into a convicted felon in a matter of hours. The authority she once flaunted had not only failed to protect her, it magnified the severity of her fall. The judge spoke plainly, emphasizing the abuse of power and the calculated nature of her crimes. There was no sympathy for someone who had used trust as a weapon. When the sentence was handed down, the weight of reality finally settled on her. 4 years in state prison, followed by years of probation, restitution, and a permanent ban from holding any HOA position. The woman who once thrived on control stood stripped of it entirely, reduced to another defendant being led away. Her protests rang hollow, her claims of community service meaningless in the face of the damage she had caused. Watching her leave the courtroom, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. The system did what fear and intimidation never could. It drew a line she could not cross. Her reign ended not with another citation or fine, but with a conviction that ensured she would never again confuse authority with ownership, or power with immunity.